Hello everybody and welcome to the series. Today we're going to be going over the digital SAT reading and writing section. This is the first of a 15 video long series which will cover the entirety of the digital SAT reading and writing section. My name is Joseph Misak and today's lesson is on paired passages, how to identify a paired passage question and how to effectively answer a paired passage question. What to expect. A paired passage question is very obvious when you first see one. The way it's structured is you will be presented with two paragraphs, both written by different authors, however they will be about the same topic. It is your job to read both passages and determine the topic of what the authors are talking about. They will then call for a comparison between the two authors' points of view. So you need to be able to determine the point of view of the authors and be able to compare the key differences between them in order to effectively answer the question. Once you have identified key details, you must be able to identify the point of view of both authors and be able to compare the two effectively. So every time I see a paired passage question, I employ this three-step method. The first is obviously to just read the passage. Read the passage carefully. Determine the common purpose of both authors' writings so that you can develop an understanding of what you're talking about. Step 2 is to determine the point of view of both authors individually and then think about how they might both compare. So I might read the first passage and think about what this author is saying and maybe the side they're arguing or the idea that they're trying to get across. And step 3 is to compare. You want to use key explicit textual evidence stated in the passages to determine a point of view of both authors and maybe think about some of the arguments that an author might make to support their topic. So let's try this method out on an example question. This is a question from an actual SAT, and using our method, we can see how we might go about answering this question. So let's start with text 1. When companies in the same industry propose merging with one another, they often claim that the merger will benefit consumers by increasing efficiency and therefore lowering prices. Economist Ying Fan investigated this notion in the context of the United States newspaper market. She modeled a hypothetical merger of Minneapolis area newspapers and found that subscription prices would rise following a merger. So, now that we've read the first passage, let's try to determine the point of view of this author. We can see that this is structured in terms of a claim being stated and then a rebuttal, or they are refuting the initial claim. The initial claim is saying that the merger will benefit consumers. However, Fan says that a hypothetical merger of the newspapers found that subscription prices would rise. So keep this in mind as we move on to our next paragraph and try to see if we can find any differences between the two authors. Text 2 says, economists Dario Foccarelli and Fabio Panetta have argued that research on the effect of mergers on prices has focused excessively on short-term effects, which tend to be adverse for consumers. Using the case of consumer banking in Italy, they show that over the long term, several years in their study, the efficiency gains realized by merged companies do result in economic benefits for consumers. So right off the bat, we can see the difference. Text 2 is arguing that merged companies in the long term specifically do result in economic benefits. Text 1 argues that a merger of Minneapolis area newspapers found that subscription prices would rise. Keep this in mind as we look at the question and see what it's asking us. The question is asking, based on the texts, how would Foccarelli and Panetta from text 2 most likely respond to Fan's findings, text 1? Please take some time, maybe read over them again, and try to answer this for yourself, and then we'll go over which answer is correct. Let's look at A. They would argue that over the long term, the expenses incurred by the merged newspaper company will also increase. We know that this is false because text 2, the text in question, is arguing that in the long term, efficiency gains would benefit consumers. Not that the expenses incurred will increase. We're talking about, consumers. We're not talking about the merged newspaper company. And we're especially not talking about expenses increasing. So we know that A is not correct. Let's look at B. B says they would recommend that FON compare the near-term effect of a merger on subscription prices in the Minneapolis area with the effect of a merger in another newspaper market. Now, the reason B is trying to trick you is because they're trying to make you think that FON should conduct a more extensive study. However, this does not relate to the question. The question is asking you, how would the authors of Text 2 respond? In Text 2, they don't talk about another newspaper market, and they definitely don't talk about the near-term effect. They're arguing that the long-term effect would result in efficiency gains and economic benefits. So we know that B is not correct either. Let's look at C. C says they would encourage FON to investigate whether the projected effect on subscription prices persists over an extended period. This question is a very good choice because this question says that the authors of Text 2 would encourage FON to investigate whether prices persist over an extended period. They're arguing about the long term in Text 2. So this seems like a very reasonable choice. Let's check D to see what it has to say. D says they would claim that the mergers have a different effect on consumer prices in the newspaper industry than in most other industries. Let's think about this one for a second. They're saying that there's a comparison that needs to be made between the newspaper industry and other industries. But Text 2 doesn't talk about any type of comparison. They're not talking about, differences in industries. They're just talking about overall merging companies result in economic benefits. They're not talking about newspapers versus any other industry. They're just talking about a general idea. So D is not correct because there's no comparison being made in Text 2. That means C would be the correct answer here because it directly relates to Text 2 and it is definitely something that the authors of Text 2 have mentioned and therefore they might argue this question. Let's look at another example. Conventional wisdom long held that human social system evolved in stages, beginning with hunter-gatherers forming small bands of members with roughly equal status. The shift to agriculture about 12,000 years ago sparked population growth that led to the emergence of groups with hierarchical structures, associations of clans first, then chiefdoms, and finally bureaucratic states. Now, let's think about this for a second. We notice that they're making the claim that human societal systems evolved in stages, and then they offer a chronological progression, hinting to the idea that human social systems evolved in stages. Okay, let's read Text 2. In the 2021 book, anthropologist David Graeber and archaeologist David Wengrow maintain that humans have always been socially flexible, alternately forming systems based on hierarchy and collective ones with decentralized leadership. The authors point to evidence that as far back as 50,000 years ago, some hunter-gatherers adjusted their social structures seasonally, at times dispersing in small groups, but also assembling into communities that included esteemed individuals. Let's think of some comparisons that can be made here. Text 2 does not talk about a linear progression. They even might offer the idea that social systems were cyclical a long time ago, changing seasonally, as they state right here. They say that systems based on hierarchy were present, but also collective ones with decentralized leadership around the same time, and that humans have always been socially flexible. So keep this in mind as we look at the question. The question is asking us, based on the texts, how would Graeber and Wengrow, Text 2, most likely respond to the conventional wisdom presented in Text 1? So let's look at some of the answer choices. A. By conceding the importance of hierarchical systems, but asserting the greater significance of decentralized collective societies. Let's think about this. A is saying that the authors of Text 2 would assert the greater significance of decentralized collective societies. However, reading Text 2, we see that decentralized leadership is mentioned. However, they don't place great emphasis on it, and they definitely don't make any argument as to why it is superior in any way or more significant in any way compared to hierarchical systems. They just mention both of the two together. So we know that A is not correct. Let's look at B. B, by disputing the idea that developments in social structures have followed a linear progression through distinct stages. This one might be a good option because it says that the authors would dispute the idea that they followed a linear progression, because text 2 says that, well, it changed a lot. It was very flexible. It might have changed by the season, and people would change their social structure. However, text 1 says that it followed a rigid linear progression. So B seems like a very good option here. Let's move on to C. C, by acknowledging that hierarchical roles likely weren't a part of social systems before the rise of agriculture. Now, this one, you have to be very careful with questions like this. They're saying that they likely weren't a part of social systems before the rise of agriculture. Text 1 definitely mentions agriculture and led to the emergence of groups with hierarchical structures. However, the question is asking you how text 2 would respond to text 1. Text 2 never mentions anything about the rise of agriculture. They talk about hunter-gatherers, but they never say that the rise of agriculture led to certain social structures. So we know that C is not correct because it never is mentioned in text 2. Let's look at D. D says, by challenging the assumption that groupings of hunter-gatherers were among the earliest forms of social structure. Once again, this is not mentioned in text 2. Text 2 explicitly says that groupings of hunter-gatherers, their social structures were socially flexible. They have always been socially flexible. And they alternately form systems depending on the season, or maybe, changing their hierarchical structure if it would benefit them, right? So we know that D is not correct because it doesn't say anything about which one was first. It just says that they all happened around the same time, and they were all present with each other. So that means that B would be the correct answer. So let's take some final notes before we wrap up this lesson. 1. Remember to read and get an understanding of the topics at hand so you know what they're arguing so that you're prepared to answer the question better. 2. Determine the differences in the point of views of the authors. This way, you can start to understand better what the authors are trying to say, and that way you can understand the topics better and be able to compare them. 3. Compare the POVs using textual evidence. Remember, we need to use explicit textual evidence in passages, and make sure that if they're asking you about text 2, you need to respond using evidence from text 2. Okay, so make sure that you know exactly what you're doing. And 4, verify. Does this comparison make sense? Remember, we're trying to answer the question. We're not trying to make a statement, anything that might be true or false. We're trying to answer the question. So make sure that your answer choice answers the question. Okay? Now, remember, every question on the reading section of the SAT will have a definite answer as to why it is correct. There is no gray space, okay? So there will always be part of a question that makes it incorrect or correct. And the correct ones will not have any, is it this or that? If you know what you're talking about, you will know exactly which questions are correct and which ones are not. So I am asking you to put a lot of emphasis on understanding the question and understanding the prompts given to you so that way you can reach a definite answer and be completely sure of your selection on the SAT. Thank you for your time. And if you enjoy these free lessons, please hit subscribe. It really helps me continue making these. And stay tuned for more videos that I post on the SAT, and good luck on your testing later.